Hi, everybody. I'll give you a moment to connect to sound. Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1116th New Social Environment. I'm Chloe Stagaman, Director of Programs here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege to be your MC today for a conversation on Apogee Press featuring Valerie Coulton, Edward Smallfield, Lara Walker, and Cole Swensen. And now I'll introduce today's guests and host. Valerie Coulton's books include Still Life with Elegy, Small Bed and Field Guide, Open Book, and The Cellar Dreamer, and Passing World Pictures. With Edward Smallfield, she's the co-author of Lirio and Anonymous. She is a co-editor at Apogee Press and curates palabrosa.net, an online chapbook and interview series. Edward Smallfield is the author of To Whom It May Concern, Equinox, 100 Famous Views of Edo, a book-length collaboration with Doug MacPherson, and The Pleasures of Sea. He has published several chapbooks, Locate with Miriam Pirone, Lirio and Anonymous with Valerie Coulton, Sargasso, Americana, and a Journal of the Plague Year. He is a co-founder and co-editor at Apogee Press. Lara Walker is the author of 6 books of poetry, Psalm Book, Story, Follow Haswed, Bird Book, Rimmertown and Atlas, and Swarmler, and 2 chapbooks, Genesis and Bird Book. Laura grew up in rural North Carolina and now lives in Berkeley, California, where she teaches poetry, keeps bees, and wrangles chickens. And our host today, Cole Swensen, is the author of 20 volumes of poetry, most recently And, which was longlisted for the Griffin Poetry Prize, and a collection of critical essays, Noise That Stays Noise. A former Guggenheim Fellow, she's been awarded the Iowa Poetry Prize, the SF State Poetry Center Book Award, and the National Poetry Series. She has also translated over 20 volumes of poetry, prose, and art criticism from French, and she won the 2004 PEN USA Award in Literary Translation. And with that, I'll pass it over to Cole.
Great. Thank you so much. And as always, thank you to the Brooklyn Rail for creating this space. And the whole purpose of this series is to shine a light on the people who do all the work that make poetry available in this country. And often those, as the people today will let you know, often those people are poets themselves. So they're spending a tremendous amount of time that they could be working on their own work, instead working on getting other people's work out to us. So greatly appreciated. And Apogee is a stellar example of that. So we'll hear first from Valerie and then from Ed with some poetry, and then we'll go into the discussion. So Valerie, I pass it over.
Thank you so much, Cole. And thanks to everyone at the Brooklyn Rail and my beautiful co-editors for today. It's such a pleasure. So I'm going to start by reading from our most recent book, which is Rendered Paradise by Suzanne Dykman and Elizabeth Robinson. And I'm going to read one piece from the first section. And the first section is called Cause for Deciphering, after Vivian Mayer. And the title of the poem is Man on Crutches with Woman Passing. Perhaps we shouldn't look, are not meant to look, at what we find unclear. Is it our own hesitation that confuses us? As fog that hovers over the curb may not be fog at all, but steam billowing from a vent, meant to make one think about an emerging underground, about things we create and others that exist only for us, felt in the back of our mind. Question, answer. I am in love with brick and soot. You must know this about me by now, that I fling my body on the smooth quarried stone of buildings, that I would grab all who walk by, pull them close. And next, I'd like to read from our book before, that came out before Rendered Paradise, which was First Cat State by Barbara Tomash. This is incredibly ambitious erasure project of Henry James' Portrait of a Woman. And I'm going to read 2 pages from this. Is everyone hearing me okay? Okay. It's so? Okay. How's this? Is this a little better? A little bit better? Okay. Tinged with rumor, reverence, they read nothing at all. 1,000 zigzags, she escaped from a trap to flame without parents, without property. A lapful of roses gratified a need in the center of property. The earth itself expected to have emotions full of kindness, stars and stripes. Nothing in this world is got for nothing. The taste of an October pear, the shadow of a deeper cloud. Dusk appears as a servant, a neat, plain face in a drawing, perhaps not in the American sequence. Devoted meditation of the last 2 centuries, small and densely filled with furniture. I love my things. Flushed with a perfect little marrying, to make use of teacups, yet broken. Absence is a source of income. To conceal the world, push it into your arms. A marriage, said Isabel, is not at all large. In her lucidity, no light to spare. And I'm going to close my reading with a piece of mine. December 31st. Bright sickle moon, names of colors. Day begins red behind branches. What I see from my balcony, sky, laundry, stacked rooms, plane trees, lights, a church, the way into the square. When his life was ending, I knew and didn't know. I called him from an escalator, from a train in a white landscape, bare trees, red barns. Felt words failing. Our incantations no longer valid. The city outskirts passing by, giving way to greater solitudes. Oh, thank you. So now I would like to pass the reading over to my beloved Edward Smallfield.
Thank you, Valerie. Thank you so much to Brooklyn Rail, to Cole, and to all of you for coming today. I'm going to follow in Valerie's footsteps. I'm going to read 2 poems by Apogee Press poets, and then one of my own. Yes, I'm going to read 2 poems by Apogee Press poets, and then one of my own. The first poem is from Patty McCarthy's marvelous book, Wife Thing, which everyone should have a copy of. And I'm not going to say any more about the book. I'm just going to read. Queen Wife Thing. A living, talking, walking, wifing, fucking, birthing, breathing, speaking treaty. God is where he was, and we are both young enough. For the sake of clarity, not all offspring are included in this tree. Her complete education included a fair hand, talking, being daughter thing to kings, and wedding kings, and giving birth naturally to kings as well. She opens the schedule for winter with a thorn, her fair hands bound, sweet posy of roses, mended, turned, new body, new hemmed. A consort has only one body. She makes her body by making other bodies. The next poem is is from an Apogee Press book that is not quite an Apogee Press book. It's Untitled Ocean by Stephen Hemingway. It'll be available in either January or February of next year. It's a wonderful book, and we'll be advertising it all over social media when the time comes. In your continuing absence for Virginia, Skolnick, Hemingway, birds, middle of their songs in branches, their notes rise and fall. Watching birds or cow is middle of thought. Its tail lifts and drops. People walk the road. Notice their hips and shoulders rise and fall, and their voices lift and fade, lift and fade. When you walked with each stride, your body fell and rose, fell and rose, fell and rose, fell, and you were but a wave. The last poem is from my book from Apogee Press, To Whom It May Concern. It's an erasure of John Cage, and it fits with Barbara's book, Her Scant State, with an eraser, and also Laura Walker's wonderful book, Fall Oswald, from Apogee Press. Sometimes too beautiful. The flavor as erotic, towards tenderness, only briefly interrupted by violence. Occasion for license, of love, a sensuousness, of music, a celebration that we own nothing. Thank you.
Thank you so much to you both for getting us off to a great start. And I know that you all wanted to talk a little bit about your original partner in this, Alice Jones. And so we'd love to hear about the start of the press, the impetus behind it, and that great contributor.
Well, I think what I'd like to do is really acknowledge Alice, because that's really unfortunate that Alice couldn't be here today. Alice and I have always described ourselves as co-founding editors, but the facts are so much, which is so normal when a man and a woman are involved. The facts are that the press was Alice's idea. I never would have thought of starting a press if it weren't for Alice. The name of the press was Alice's idea. The logo for the press was Alice's idea. Alice connected us with our designer, Philip Crana, whom we're going to talk about a lot later, and who's been very important to us in our continuity. Alice brought some of our most important writers to us early on, people like Denise Newman and Patty McCarthy. So we can get into the whole founding impetus later, but it's really, really too bad that Alice isn't here today, because all of us are here as a physical presence, and she's here very much in the books, in the press, and everything that's happened, but she couldn't be here personally, and that's very, very unfortunate.
Great. Well, also just wanted to point to her wonderful poetry that
Yeah.
everybody
Yes. And in fact, Alice has published several books with Apogee Press, along with many, many other presses.
Yeah. Do you want to go into looking at some slides, or would you like to talk a little bit first? What's your preference on that?
Oh, no, let's go right. I mean, Valerie and Laura, what do you think? We're going fine with going to your questions directly.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so here you just have a bit of a collage of many of our covers, and we prepared this for our 25th anniversary, which we celebrated recently. And it was interesting for me as a newer editor on the press to go back and look at all of the books and think about where Apogee Press started. Do you want to say something about the beginnings? How you talked about the founding of it, but do you want to say something about how you started to develop?
Well, that's an interesting process. Probably, yeah. Let me say a little bit. I think anyone who starts a press must think that there's more poetry to be published than there are presses to publish it, and usually that person or person thinks that there's a particular kind of poetry that's not getting as much of a hearing as it should. When Alice and I started Apogee Press in the Bay Area in the late 90s, there was a lot of really cool stuff going on in poetry. The language poets were thriving. The descendants of the Beats are always with us in the Bay Area with lots of other currents. But we felt that there was a poetry that wasn't necessarily named or grouped, where people were doing really, really interesting things. We talked about innovative language, we talked about cultural diversity, but we felt like we were better at defining ourselves by the books we published than with abstract statements. So our second two books, Placing the Accents and Human Forest, Placing the Accents by Trong, and Human Forest by Denise Newman, are kind of a good example of books that people would not necessarily put together. Trong is writing about the immigrant experience of a gay Vietnamese man. Denise's life experience is very different, but they both write in a very interesting way formally. They're both experimental. Their work is both full of emotion and full of intellect. And so we were kind of defining ourselves by points. We were defining ourselves by the people we published. Another example of a pair of books, again, very early in the history of the press, Rules of the House by Sering Wang Mondompa, and Book of Hours by Patty McCarthy. Those two books are very similar in a way, in contrast to Trong's Placing the Accent and Denise's Human Forest. Sering is writing from the experience of a Tibetan refugee in India, in Nepal, in the United States. Patty writes almost always about European and American history. But again, the way the two approach language, the way they approach putting a poem together, putting a book together, has certain similarities. So I think that might be a good way to talk about the start of the press. Valerie, Laura, do you want to add something as readers and poets who've been published by the press? Because you were not editors at that point.
Yeah, I think one thing that's interesting for both Valerie and me is we started out as readers for the press, and then we became writers for the press, and then we became editors. So we have a similar trajectory in that way. So actually, there were several people that I only know because Apogee published them. Sering is one of them. And I think that the important thing to me is that Ed once described the press in the way he and Alice envisioned it initially as a meeting place, as a crossroads for Bay Area poetry that might not meet or cross otherwise. And as I've looked at all the books, I feel like there are things they have in common, but they're a little hard to voice because I don't think it's content and it's not form. That really varies a lot, but it's more about an approach and a curiosity about language itself and innovation, but also with an idea of not eschewing an emotional impact as well. So not purely intellectual. But that idea has stuck with me, that idea of a crossroads for different kinds of poetry and different poets to meet in the work of Apogee Press. Valerie?
Yeah, I think it's been the same for me. And the openness that Ed and Alice had to very different kinds of voices and different kinds of projects, and also publishing multiple works by single authors over time, and being open to the multiplicity of each writer's works. So, for example, Trong has several books, Denise has several books with the press, Patty has a number of books. Within each person's work, there's a lot of diversity there as well. And so this combination of openness, loyalty, curiosity, and being able to see what's fascinating about someone's work and being willing for that to change has been it's really opened up horizons for me. And I know other people have said the same thing, that we have learned as writers and as readers, we have learned so much from the Apogee bookshelf over time. It's been an education for us of writers that we might never have heard from or discovered.
I noticed that Human Forest is now in a different configuration with Book of Hours. There must be different things binding those two works.
Yeah, here what we want to speak to is first books and our Apogee's excitement about being a place where writers can publish their first books. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Well, yeah, I want to mention we are proud of the first books that we published, and there are several of them: Human Forest by Denise Newman, Book of Hours by Patty McCarthy, Rules of the House by Sering Mangmo Dompa, Passing World Pictures by Valerie Coulton, Peeping Moth by Andrew Maxwell, and Poor Anima by Katie Chong. There is something particularly exciting about bringing out a first book. Most of those poets had published in chapbook form before their first books. But there's something about a first book that's obviously a milestone for a poet and kind of for the poetry world, because it's the first full-length connection by a new voice. And there's always a joy in working on a book with a poet, but there's especially a joy in bringing a first book into the world. I want to say, on the other hand, though, you can also see from our publications, we like to think of ourselves as very loyal to our poets. We love our poets, and we want to continue to publish them. And we think there's a certain freedom for a poet in knowing that when you finish a book, someone will consider it very, very, very seriously. That after that first book, you won't be in exactly the same situation where you're trying to get a hearing from somebody. And so we have a kind of push-pull between wanting to publish new books and bring new writers into the world, and at the same time to support the poets whom we love so much and make sure that their work has a place.
Right. And how many first books have you done? Do you know offhand? Is it these 6, or are there others as well?
I think it's these 6.
I think that those are the six first books that we published.
Yeah.
And how did you find these writers? Did they send material to you and you discovered them through that method, or word of mouth, or had you seen their work in a journal, or?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. I wanted to say that we've also published some writers very, very early on. Like, we didn't publish Tron's first book, but we did publish his second book. And so we were still an early adopter of Tron's work. Poets have come to us in different ways. Tron and I were students in the MFA program at SF State together. And I had seen his work in workshops and was really jazzed about it. We didn't know each other very well personally. Alice brought Denise and Patty to the press. Valerie had been my student. Sering simply sent us a manuscript. None of us knew Sering, but it was such a great manuscript that we came to know her really well and to become a good friend. Andrew Maxwell, Valerie and I met at a poetry conference in Greece. Katie Chong was actually referred to us by Elizabeth Robinson. Katie was Elizabeth's student in Denver. So people have come to us in pretty much all the possible ways that you could meet someone. People we knew well, or people whom we at least knew, people we were in classes with, and in Sering's case, someone who simply sent a manuscript.
Nice, great. And then, of course, Kathleen, work we're looking at here.
Well, that one, Kathleen's book is kind of special for all of us, because for Valerie, for Laura, and for me, Kathleen was really important, both as a poet and as a person. So having done a book by Kathleen was a really big deal. And since I worked on the book with Kathleen, it was the most sweaty palms book I had ever done because I had so much invested in that book being the way that Kathleen wanted it. So yeah, that was an amazing experience.
I think that's an interesting point, because I think part of your project from the beginning was to give writers the book that they wanted to have.
Yeah.
And that is such a labor of love. It always has been such a labor of love. And I think for myself personally, when Apogee published my book, but in this case, for example, a lot goes into that. There is a lot that goes into bringing a physical book into the world that is what the writer wants it to be, and that is a full collaboration among writer, editor, or editors, and designer. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, my greatest fear in doing a book is that the poet will have poet's remorse, either about the physical book or about the process. And so when I said that Discrete Categories Forced into Coupling was the most sweaty palm book I ever did, I love doing books, but part of the joy of doing them is the sweaty palms feeling that you really, really, really want them to be right. And you also want the poet to feel that they're right. And so working with the poet is what doing the book is about for me. We're really lucky in our designer that Philip is incredibly creative, but he also happens to be a saint. And he's willing to subvert his design skills and his artistic skills to the idea that the book is not, first of all, an opportunity for him to display how good he is as a designer. It's to get the poet's aesthetic into the interior and the cover of the book. And
I just wanted to add to that my first book with Apogee was my fourth book of poetry. And compared to any of the other presses I worked with, the thing that made Apogee really, really stand out was how committed Ed and Alice were to doing exactly what I wanted to see, even when I didn't even know what that was. But there were so many rounds and iterations. And I feel like that is something that really makes, I hope still, Apogee special, is that Ed and Alice's commitment to really, really bringing forth a beautiful object in the hands, but also something that realizes a poet's own vision for a book.
Valerie, you used the word collaboration, and that was what I was thinking as you began to describe the interaction. And I think that giving the writer so much kind of control over the whole book object is unusual and creates a really different kind of object and therefore kind of experience.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and it is a true collaboration. And what I notice is so much, you talked about the saintliness of Philip, which is definitely true, but I also think there's a lot of patience on the part of our writers to be a full participant in that process, which sometimes can feel like, oh my God, am I looking at another version here? Oh, making the corrections, trying to get that cover really what we want. And, it can be a long process, but I think our writers are very patient, generous, and committed also to having the book that they want. So I think it's great that we get to do that.
And I think that segues into something else that the three of us had talked about, but that commitment of time and resources is only possible because Apogee Press has never been, how did you put it, a commercial enterprise. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, I mean, when Alice and I started the press, we were really clear about the idea that one of the things that we wanted to do was to publish work that might not get a hearing from another press. So we weren't there to publish work that would easily be published. That meant, in our minds, that we couldn't make commercially based decisions, right? That we would never not publish a book because we wouldn't sell enough copies to break even on the book. At the same time, as wonderful as nonprofits are, we felt like there was a certain freedom in operating outside of the nonprofit space. So we kind of made a commitment from the beginning that we were okay with not making money and we were okay with not breaking even. That the main purpose of the press was aesthetic, and that we've had some good fortune, and a few of our books have sold a lot of copies. But in general, the profitability or breaking even is not a part of our calculus when we think about it.
Yeah. You're in a sense getting the profit is experience and creating rather than financial. So that's really frees you up, I'm sure.
Right. But we also get the great joy of working on the press, and I think all poets should have the opportunity to be editors, because I think being an editor and working on books gives you so much insight into poetry that it's an educative experience for the editor.
Yeah, without a doubt. Tell us about this book.
Mary Bones?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if I didn't know Mary Bones was by Patty McCarthy, I would guess that it was by Patty McCarthy, because Mary Bones is an incredibly Patty McCarthy title, as is Life Thing. I was talking to some young Spanish women writers about the press, and we were looking at some of the book covers. And when they came to Mary Bones, they were completely jazzed, because, Mary kind of looms large in Spain, right? So I think that's one of Valerie's favorite covers.
Oh, I love this cover.
I love that cover too.
Yeah, great.
It's always fascinating to work on Patty's books. Patty's a joy to work with, partly because she has an incredibly clear vision of what she's doing. She always picks a cover. She always picks a great cover. That book really, really drills down into history and the nature of what do we want to call it? The myth, the legend, the story of the Virgin Mary in Catholic liturgy. It's really fascinating. It's really fascinating. And Patty's incredible ability to bring all kinds of things together. The name Mary, the use of the name Mary. It's an amazing book.
Yeah, and I think we've got some other covers here that we just want to be able to show to everyone so that you can see the work of our designer in terms of covers. We don't have any pictures for you of the interior, but what I really want to highlight about Philip, and why I think he's been the perfect collaborator for Apogee, is that he's able to enter into the very distinctive different projects and bring them together with a design through line that makes them recognizable as our books. I think that's really remarkable, because these books are formally very different from one another. And yet when you open them, I think if you're familiar with our books, you know it's an Apogee book when you open it, even though the way that poetry is laid out on the page or the size of the book or what have you might be quite different. He has the long relationship that you've had with him. You started working together 25 years ago. It's been magical, I think. And it's a remarkable body of work that he's created as a collaborator with the press.
I was thinking too about the relationship between the materiality, the book as an object, and how that can underscore the content and the spirit of the book. And I wondered, do you find the rise of digitalization and the ubiquity now of poetry in this kind of non-material in a certain way? I mean, obviously, the internet, the digital world is also material, but in such a different way. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about that relationship of materiality, and is that changing?
Well, I think it's really fascinating because when Valerie and I didn't necessarily move to Barcelona 20 years ago with the idea of staying, but we ended up staying. And Alice was very generous in the way that Laura is very generous in doing all of the things that have to be done by someone who's physically in the United States. And so to try to balance that, when Alice and I were working together and I was in Barcelona, the one thing that I could easily do from Barcelona was book production with Philip and the poet. So I tended to take on more of that because Alice was forced to take on more to do with events, with getting books places, with certain kinds of business things. So I'm often struck by the fact that when Philip and I and the poet are working together, there's an irony that we're using a completely digital process to create an analog object. And that especially gets complicated with covers because what you see on your screen or what your printer prints is not what the cover will actually look like. So, and it's very interesting that I tend to think of our poets as book-oriented and physical object-oriented. A lot of our poets think about the page as a space. They think in terms of books. I was very disturbed when we were working with SPD to do ebooks of Dust and Conscience by Tron and Rules of the House by Sereng, because in the ebook, the reader can mess with the page format. And I know how important the page format is to Tron. Think about Mallarmé having to deal with people messing with the spacing, right? And so there's definitely, I guess what I'm hoping, and Philip and I were able to see each other because Valerie and we saw him at the 25th anniversary celebration. We were talking about his design students who were obviously very into the digital, also love the analog. They love to do photography with film rather than digitally. So I hope we can continue to coexist with an analog world and a digital world where they're both beautiful and they complement each other. I mean, we're on Zoom now sharing book covers, right? Yeah. And the other thing that's interesting, though, as I said, I tended to think that many of our poets are very, very oriented toward the page in the book. Andrew Maxwell is the opposite. I kind of had to drag the book out of Andrew's hands. The fact that it would be a physical book and not on the internet, and therefore that he couldn't just go and change it whenever he wanted to. Somewhat disturbing to Andrew as someone who started out in life working for Google. So that was a very different perspective for me. So we're in a time when all of these things are in conversation and in flux. But I personally would not want to lose the physical book, the page, the analog world. We'll see what the young do with that, right?
Yeah. I saw a glimpse of the 25th anniversary celebration in the next slide. Do we want to segue into that? And
Yeah.
When I got up there, I couldn't resist taking a picture. So this is a picture when I was at the lectern of all these faces, all these beloved faces, and just the beautiful community that Apogee brings together. And it was just an incredibly joyful moment.
Where are we physically or digitally?
This is in Orinda, in the church where Elizabeth Robinson is currently the pastor.
Great.
Yeah, and you can see Elizabeth there behind Edward and myself. Unfortunately, you can't see Laura because she's taking the photograph. You can see a lot of our authors, Barbara is there, and some other folks, Steve Havenaway, whose book is
Elizabeth is there.
And just going back to that previous slide, I think this gathering was very momentous for us because to be able to celebrate 25 years together is a remarkable thing. We also used it as a way to honor Kathleen Fraser. She's the only Apogee writer who is no longer with us. So we had a broadside printed of one of her pieces from discrete categories, forced into coupling. And what I felt about this event, and what I think that we were aiming for, was to celebrate the joy of it, to thank people for being with us, but also to feel again the way that Laura talked about this before, the way that Apogee has created a meeting point for people. And I felt it again. I felt like there were people from kind of different corners of the Bay Area poetry community who were there, who might not normally be in the same room together. So for me, that was a really beautiful thing. And it was also amazing. We went to the storage space. We got all of our books. We brought, well, not all of them, but we brought a representation of all of our books. So we had about 400 books in this room for people to purchase or to take for free or what have you. There was food and drink. There were 11 poets reading, and it really felt like the culmination and celebration of an amazing project.
Great.
Did you see anything else about it?
You're so eloquent that I have nothing to add.
Great.
So if you go on to this next slide, we thought that this would be an interesting one to share in light of the new social environment, because one of the gifts to us of the pandemic was to start doing Zoom readings, which we had never done before for the press. And so we started, when a new book would come out, we would organize a reading for the poet and those who had written blurbs for that book. And this is a beautiful practice that we continue. And earlier, Chloe was talking about, before we came on the public part of the call, we were talking about the practice of the Brooklyn Rail, of creating this meeting point for people 5 days a week. We're only doing that maybe once or twice a year, but it's a powerful meeting point, and we've continued to do it. And the slide that we see here is actually the reading for Laura's book, Psalm Book, which the press published before Laura came on as a co-editor. But this was we chose this slide because it was a particularly moving event. Laura read beautifully, as she always does. But what struck many of us as being remarkable about it was that it was the first time that people in her non-poetry world had ever heard her read.
Oh,
Yeah, you can
Yeah.
see my dad is there, and my aunt and my stepmother and various other people, which they live on the other side of the country. So they just would not have an opportunity to ever hear me read. And they were not shy about their comments either, were they? So yeah, they jumped right in.
Yeah. And so it was it's been a real gift to keep doing this and to recognize that we don't have, it's kind of like the conversation about analog and digital. They kind of go together. So we don't have to only gather in person or online. We can do both. We can have both. So now when one of our books comes out, we try to have events that the poets and their listeners and friends can come to physically, but then we always have an online event.
great.
And I think that way that extends our community is fantastic, because people can join from all over the world. And I think that's just been a great development for us that we're going to keep on doing.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
Actually, that creates a nice segue, because one thing I wanted to ask about, with 2/3 of the editorial board being in Barcelona, that's a really interesting internationalizing gesture. And I wondered, since you've been there for 20 years, what has the influence been on the press? Are there influences from that? I don't see how there could help but be.
What do you think?
Influences on the press. Well, I was thinking about this earlier today, that one of the things that has been interesting for me personally before I joined the press was coming out of the Bay Area poetry community, where I had started my life as a writer and reader. In some ways, allowed me to see it in a different way. So I think it's changed our perspective in some ways. Maybe it has widened my perspective to a great extent. But I'm not sure that you should speak to it, because you were editing the press for a long time from here before I joined. So what do you think?
Well, I mean, it's really clear to me that Apogee Press is an endeavor in the context of American poetry. It would be very interesting, for instance, to publish translations, but we're far too busy to publish translations. We're far too engaged with publishing original work. I could turn the question around and ask you about living in Paris, but obviously when you live in a country that's not your own country, your exposure to literature is different. And you read more books of Catalan poetry and Spanish poetry and Italian poetry and French poetry and Greek poetry. But for me, the conversation for me, to be honest, as a poet and as an editor, is always I don't want to sound like William Carlos Williams, but it's always an American conversation. And it's not that I haven't been influenced by living in Barcelona, living in Europe, reading literatures which are not American literature. But the basic endeavor of the press, for me personally, is always very much in the context of American poetry.
Yeah, great. Interesting.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah, yeah. And there's a question I want to save for maybe a little bit later, because there's a couple other things I want to get to first, but that has to do with how living in a Spanish-speaking environment has changed your own work. But I wanted to ask a more general question, and for all three of you, of how editing has changed your own writing. And maybe, yeah, I'll just let you take it from there in any way you'd like.
Well,
I'll jump in and say that one of the joys of joining the press as a co-editor is getting to look at manuscripts with Ed and Valerie, and that collaborative process where we take our time over and over and over and really dive into a manuscript and think about it. And each time we come back, because we're a non-commercial entity, we take a huge amount of time and really give a manuscript as much time as we feel like we want to give it. It's a learning process, right? Anytime that you're in deep conversation about a book of poetry, whether you end up accepting it for the press or deciding it isn't the best fit for the press, you're just learning a huge amount. And to be able to be in conversation with Ed and Valerie deeply around poetry definitely informs what I do when I go back to my own writing, for sure.
Great, yeah.
I think that's true for us too, and the feeling is mutual that Laura is one of the most remarkable readers, and she's so able to articulate what she sees in work that it's been an education for me, and I treasure that. So that is one of the joys, but also one of the great learning experiences of getting to work together. Since I live with Ed, I get to talk with him about poetry all the time. So I think this, now that we are a threesome here talking about these things, it's really made it even richer. And I guess for me personally, to me, being an editor is is fantastic. I think you said earlier, I feel like every poet should get the opportunity to be an editor, because start reading as an editor just opens up huge possibilities. And it's also challenging. It's been a challenge for me to open myself up to work that I didn't initially respond to. So it's been a real eye-opener about what's possible, what I never would have thought of, what true diversity is in writing, what true experimentation is in writing. So from that perspective, and then also on the project level of what's a book, what's a page, what's a word, what's poetry? I mean, the questions are deep ones, and it's almost like every time you encounter a manuscript, you're almost learning a new language, I would say. There's the potential of learning a new language. What is that gesture doing? What is that? How does it work? What are the opportunities? So for me, it's been an amazing chance to try things in my own writing.
Yeah, I want to say I really agree with Valerie and Laura. The conversations about books with Alice, with Valerie, with Laura are incredibly enlightening. For me personally, working on the production of books has really changed my writing a lot. It's in the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas. Alice is talking about proofreading Stein's The Making of the Americans. And she says that you've never really read a book until you've read it as you follow it throughout the editorial process. So to really live with a book of poems and look at it over and over and over again, but at the same time, working with a number of really different poets, getting to see the very, very, very different ways in which people work on their poetry, make their poetry, to what degree they're absolutely certain at the beginning that they want the book to be the way it is, the way that they are, on the other hand, constantly wanting to change the book in process, which we are crazy enough to let poets do. It opens up your thoughts about how writing is done and how poems are made and how books are made. And it allows you as a poet to see that there really are multiple ways of doing things, and ways of doing things that you personally have never considered because you're stuck in the rigidity of your own process. So for me, that's been a tremendous opportunity.
That's a great point. The idea of just seeing someone else's decision-making process from the inside, and who's hesitant, who, as you say, is super sure, and what's it look like on the surface? You probably can't predict who's going to be super sure as opposed to who's going to be hesitant from the actual work. So what a surprise that must be from time to time.
It's a huge surprise, and it's never what I would have expected. And again, what it's proof of is that when you're making works of art, when you're making poems, when you're making books of poems, everybody has a different way of doing it, and there's no right way to do it. And people change. People change from book to book. They have a very different attitude toward, and it's not moving from less certain to more certain. It's often the opposite. It's often moving from more certain to less certain.
Yeah.
As poets.
I have a last question that is quirky. And all three of you have written books whose titles are not capitalized, no capitalized words in the titles. And I've noticed that many other of the books you've published are no capital letters in the titles. And I wondered, is that just a coincidence? Or does that reflect a particular value? It just got me thinking about the way in which values get expressed materially, or is it involved in a conversation of some sort? Or, as I say, is it just complete coincidence?
Laura, what do you think?
Well, as Cole was asking that question, what came to mind is perhaps freedom. I teach adults. I've taught adults poetry for 25 years, but I also recently have started teaching kids. And one thing when I'm teaching kids, I try to get them enticed the very first lesson I teach. And one thing I say to them is that I haven't used a capital letter in my poems for 20 years. And they all go, oh, I'm gonna love poetry. And so like there's this idea of just the absolute freedom to take, I mean, and obviously there are many more ways to do it than lacking capital letters, but this idea that you can take the language, take the materiality of language, do something outside the expected norms, I think that might hold all of our books, whether we use capital letters or not, that might hold them together. What do you guys think?
I think that's an excellent comment. Yeah.
I completely agree with
Yeah.
what Laura said. I think it is a sign of freedom. I also think it's great that we're in a moment when you have the option of not using capital letters or using capital letters, that there's no standard. I mean, in Apogee Press books, we have a lot of titles that are all lowercase. We also have a lot of titles that use capitals in a very conventional, in the standard manner. So it's just another one of those things where having the maximum amount of freedom is the most important thing.
Great, good. So we're kind of up at the top of the hour, so time to segue into Q&A. But I wanted to thank you, all three of you, for just really, really great and thoughtful taking us through your work, taking us through your books in such a stimulating way. And I also wanted to ask if any of the three of you want to make any comments before we shift to the Q&A, or ask each other any questions before we shift.
I would really like to thank everybody, and if any of the people watching have had half as much fun as I have had, I'd be very gratified, because this has just been such a pleasure for me.
Yeah.
For us, this is coming right on the tail of celebrating our 25 years, which we did, I guess it's been 2 weeks now, 2 weeks ago. And so it feels like almost an extension of that and into the next 25 years. But this has been a lot of fun. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I want to thank you, Cole, for thinking of us, and thank everyone at Brooklyn Rail, and to thank everyone here. I see a lot of good friends here, and it's so wonderful to see your names and see your faces. And then I see a lot of other wonderful people here. So thanks for turning out for us today.
Okay, well, questions.
Yeah.
Comments.
And we have a question to start with from Laura Mullen. Before I read Laura's question, please feel free to post questions at the link in the chat, and we will turn to you next. But this question's from Laura. Laura says, congratulations on 25 wonderful years. You've published so many books I adore. My question is about the next 25 years. Can you talk a bit about your vision going forward? And if 25 years is too far ahead, Laura says, or the next 5 years.
Yeah, do you want to start with that?
Yes, and but I want you and Laura to chime in, because we have not talked about this, have we?
Well, not exactly, but it's kind of in process for us, I guess.
Yeah,
we can talk about it now. We'll talk
about it now. I think what's interesting is, Ed has been there since the very beginning, and in some ways, is just the heart and soul of this press. And then Valerie and I have come in, like I said, first as readers of the press, then as authors on the press, and then suddenly now, not suddenly anymore, but we're joining as editors of the press. And so part of, I think, what we're working out is what we want to continue from the last 25 years. And Ed is incredibly open and generous and welcoming for Valerie and me to add our own ideas of things we want to do or directions we want to go. So yeah, I'm not sure we've had the conversation, but I do feel like the three of us can do just about anything we want.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of, we're flying the flag of freedom. Also, I want to point out that aesthetically, in one of our conversations earlier this year, Laura really encapsulated our shared aesthetic as experimental lyric. And that really hit home with the two of us because Apogee evolved publishing books and having a framework for looking at works. But something about Laura's being able to crystallize this idea, I think has been helpful for us. And we're committed to that, I think, but we remain committed to cultural diversity, intellectual diversity, emotional diversity, and bringing loyalty to our beloved poets, continuing to be a home for their work, but also discovering new works. And I think that's where it seems like we are right now.
I don't have a lot to add. I think I mentioned that when Alice and I were starting the press, we felt like we were better at defining ourselves by the books we published than by making abstract statements. And so, I mean, for me, what's exciting is that I'm not sure that we know where we're going, because where we're going to go is where the poets go. They're going to define the press by what they write. And given the poets that we know and the poets that we publish, that is going to be really, really exciting.
Thank you so much for that answer. Where we're going to go is where the poets go. I love that. I am going to turn it over to Magli next for the next question.
Thank you, Chloe. Thank you all so much. This was so insightful, and I'm definitely looking forward to following the poems and seeing where they lead us. My question was about your design process, and I was very curious about why it's so important that you have a design identity that is tied to Apogee.
Laura?
Well, I think,
Oh, go ahead, Valerie.
yeah, no, go ahead, Laura.
Well, I was just going to say that one of the things that's come up in our conversation when we talk about how lucky we feel that we've had one designer for 25 years is what Ed talked about before, about how even though each of the books is quite different, they have this apogee sense that ties them together, which in large part is due to Philip, and how the fact that we publish some disparate poetry, and definitely authors have different approaches to things, this is one of the things that ties us together as a press. I remember we talked about that a couple of days ago. Go ahead, Valerie.
No, I think that's well said. In terms of process, just the way it works, when we choose a manuscript, we try to get to the quote final version with the poet, which is never really the final version, but as close as we can. And then share that with Philip. So he starts to work on the interior first. And then we're in conversation with the poet about their ideas for cover art. And then we try to obtain the work that they want to use. We have a lot of interesting stories to tell about that. That's for another gathering. We've worked with the Vatican. We've worked with the Dead Sea Scrolls people. We've worked with some different folks to get cover image assets. Philip starts to work on covers. So this is kind of happening. There's a ton of back and forth, and everyone is sharing their opinions. It's a very collaborative process. And then, and of course, sometimes I think with Andrew's book, Andrew really didn't want to use our format. He wanted some different things that we had never had that were not part of the kind of Apogee design. And I think some of those ended up in the final book.
Yeah, it's the only time we just flat out said no to a poet. Andrew didn't want a barcode on a book, which means you can't sell it. And whereas we're not commercial, we do like to sell books. So that was like, no, it's really, barcodes are incredibly ugly. And I wish we would change the world and have beautiful barcodes, but we don't. And we want our books in bookstores. So that was just a deal breaker. It's the only deal breaker we've ever had in design.
Yeah. Does that answer your question, Magli?
Yes, it does. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much for that question, Magli, and for those answers, Laura, Edward, and Valerie. Fong is going to come on for a second and say hello, and then we'll close out with a question from Min. So Fong, go for it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This book here, The Little Magazine America, was published in 78, and it was given to me by the great Irvin Howe. And that was maybe in 1992. So I gone through this. Oh, I'm just going to share with you. One thing I remember quoting Anatole France to Irvin when I visited him: never lend books to those who never return them. Half of the books in my library are those I borrow from my friends. So I don't lend books anymore. But just to prove that Apogee must be written in the next volume. And I'm working with a young PhD friend who's going to do this at the current volume. So thank you to keep up what you guys all been doing for so long. 25 years, that's a year even longer than the Brooklyn Rail, So the idea is the movement of a butterfly wings, maybe in Newton Creek, which is behind where I live, can set up a tornado somewhere in Austin, Texas. And I think that's how things works. So thank you so much. Thank you, Cole, for being such a beautiful host, brilliant host all the time. And thank you, you guys. I'm up now to a meeting, but I just want to send off my admiration and keep up all the good work. Thank you.
And thank you, Fong, for giving us the space. Really.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Fong. Our last question today is going to be from Min. Min, I'll pass the mic over to you.
Hi again. Thank you so much for the lovely conversation. Laura, you mentioned something about breaking the rules and sort of playing with the rules. And I think all three of your practices kind of deal with knowing all the rules and breaking them in subtle, intentional, and creative ways. And I was wondering if that kind of bleeds into your life or your practice as an editor or publisher outside of your sort of writing practice.
Yeah, I think, thank you for that question. I think absolutely, because I think that not only are the manuscripts that we are attracted to and interested in, and as Valerie said, the ones that we go again and again and see more and more and more tend to be those manuscripts that approach things in ways that surprise us, right? Because we're constantly learning and we're constantly curious. So that's what we're attracted to. But even in our editorial process, I think that with Ed's amazing example and generous invitation, we are very open to breaking the rules and trying to do things differently and approach things in a way that gets us ever closer to something that we can't quite articulate, either in our poetry, in the manuscripts we pick, or in the editorial process. I think that idea of freedom and being able to approach things in a way that is free of the expectations of the past in some ways has been a big part. What do you think, Ed and Valerie?
Yeah, I think so too. And I think what happened for me, man, when I heard your question was I thought, how has doing this work changed my life and how I am in the world? And I think that the contact with Apogee Press, and of course the contact with Edward and Laura, has absolutely changed my idea of what it is to be alive and what it is to experience different visions of life and of what it means to be and what it means to be human. So that's been absolutely profound. And I think all of the Apogee books have played into that. They've all given me an opportunity to live in a different way.
What a beautiful question, man. Thank you so much for all of those answers. It was such a great closing thought to end on. And now I'm going to pass it over to Lara for our concluding reading.
Thank you, Chloe. This has been such a pleasure. I'm going to read just like about a minute from 3 different books, following in Ed and Valerie's footsteps, a couple books from people that we have published over the years, and then I'll finish with a minute from my latest book from Apogee. So the first book I'm going to read from is one of Sering's books. I think she's done 3 books with us. And this poem is called Mother Will Not Grow Old. It's a poem I used to teach a lot when I was teaching at SF State. Mother will not grow old. Last night, in a corner of this dark room, I thought of you. What would you think of the flowers before my window? Are they of deceptive origin? Do their colors indicate right motive? Ought I to ascribe to the moon to the lines in my palm? Or am I once again asking the wrong questions? Years go by. I have lived without your help, but you tell me, when will this end? Words break off from their source except in dreams where you stand closer than the stranger I see on the street. Mother is not a word I use anymore. It serves its purpose well as example and evaluation. Rapscallion, you. I am aging, while you're still wearing that seaweed green dress we took to the tailor during her lunch, and she kept a little space in the waist, just in case, you know. I do not miss you. I do not look around me seeing mug, slipper, sink on mornings when the ordinary is just as it is. But you are here, and you're never going to grow old. So that was Sering's. I'm also want to read from Alice Jones. Again, I'm really sorry she couldn't be here because she's such a huge part of this press as the co-founding editor. I'm going to read from her latest book called Vault. And as Alice describes it, she said a lot of what Apogee publishes are maybe slightly minimalist. She said this is a maximal book, and these are maximal poems. So because of the time constraint, I'm actually going to read the beginning and the end of one of her poems, just because we don't have time to read the whole thing. But I encourage all of you to get this book. It's really amazing. So with the idea of maximality, is that a word? Maximalness. Here's a piece of Alice's poem E from Vault. Breath sealed inside a breath, held in salt on a rubber cord, the echo inside yourself of those who died before, whose place you took inside the 4 directions, the 28 lunar mansions, the Dipper Mother, sailing out underneath the orange gate, flood tide buoy bell marker. The ghost in parquetted halls, barbed fences, flung window, persimmon tree, an ocean where you found a voice speaking, a protea flowering for the first time, solstice wobbling in. We sew and unsew, dangled thread, the dish ran away, happenstance and not, the docked loons, waving reeds. For many moons we waited for the arrival of the silvered creature whose word would open the unopened. Now I'm going to move to the end. Reach for dark orange, the rose in full leaf, green beach grasses, dawn, the zing bats, urgent sun won't sit and wait like an egg, a beak pecks through, fractures, and then the struggle of wet feathers begins in earnest. Breathing aims so much life, molecular pulse, aspiration, aeration, the sleeves rolled up and the nape soaked in its own sweat. Change, the moon goddess lives in a great cold palace, trigrams, dragons, chanting such as abnormal in the shape of pigs, cats, dogs, or all those who eat their own young. The value in a mind, a square jar, only island. Bird gyre, swoop and beak, the fine feathered exit, swallowtail blue, smooth and riparian. So that is from Alice's book, and I'm going to finish by just reading 1 minute from Songbook. And something special about this book for me is that this was a new kind of project for me. I ended up channeling the Psalms, the King James version of the Psalms, and it was so uncomfortable for me that I sat with this manuscript for a long time. And I can safely say that it is only because Ed and Valerie were so encouraging to me that this book even exists, because they really supported this project and really allowed me to bring it out in the world, because I was very, very unsure of what this process had led me to. So I'll just read a few from this at about a minute. Psalm 85. I remember you. Once you walked in this land and made soft thrumming sounds. Once you were outlined in paper. Psalm 8. A braided moon. Animals under our feet. Psalm 84. We fade and lean. Flesh, boxy with yearning. Sparrows a tumult. The rain comes down, and 1,000 cards lying on the floor. 1,000 cards. Psalm 141. Sound from throats. We all sacrifice something. And Psalm 16. At night, I confess to drinks with my neighbors. Brown clay cups, plastic plate. You want no part of me. They hasten after each other. I am waiting for you. A night season stretched. Thank you.
Lara, that was so beautiful.
All so much. Yeah. Go for it, Chloe.
No, thank you. I'm just gonna say the same thing. Thank you so much. And Lara, that was a really beautiful way to close. Thank you, Valerie. Thank you, Edward. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Cole. Today was so lovely. And it was really, really amazing to get to hear more about Apogee and to celebrate your work. I'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art, who sponsor the New Social Environment program and make weekday conversations like this one possible. They also support our archive, where you'll be able to watch this shortly on YouTube. The Rail has been free and independent for 24 years. We are celebrating our 24th anniversary this month, and we're seeking to raise $200,000 towards our operations and our staff and our program. So we encourage you to check the link in our profile to donate to our work. And if you're free tomorrow at 1 p.m., join us for a conversation with curators Emily Edwards, Sarah Hignite, and artists Viva Ruiz, Eliza Schwartz, and Natanya Nota, hosted by artist Gabby Collins Fernandez on the occasion of Is It Real? Contemporary Artists Address Reproductive Freedom at Lagoon Studio in Dallas, Texas. And as is real tradition, you all can now turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so much for sharing.
And I would like to just thank Magli and Min as well as Chloe and the whole Rail staff. Thank you so much for making this space for us.
Thank you very, very much. It's been wonderful.
Yeah,
Bye, everybody. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Edward, Valerie, and Cole. Thank you.
Thank you all so
Long live
much.
Apogee! Long live Apogee!
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Many thanks.